Darkcast Network. Welcome to the dark side of podcasts.
Content warning ahead. This podcast contains very sensitive topics such as missing persons, unsolved cases, haunted houses, and paranormal activity. These type of topics can contain very upsetting, sensitive details and stories. Please listen responsibly. Welcome to Misty Mysteries, a podcast in the business of ghostly spooks and chilling crimes. I'm your host, Keely, and today's episode is one of my favorite type of episodes to put together, and I definitely think it's one of my more requested type of episodes. That, of course, is a mix of both true crime and a touch of the spooky. Today's topic is the Mary Celeste Ship. And since this topic has been told time and time again, I have done my best during my research to only use articles or videos made by historians or those who are focusing on historical accuracy, at least for the parts that should be historically accurate. The start of the ship is a fairly interesting story itself. In 1860, a man named Joshua Dewis went to the small town of Spencer's Island, a town named after a nearby island. This town is full of people who are either related in some way by either marriage or blood. Joshua is a shipmaker and went to the family he had in this town to help invest in this little project he had. He was going to open up his own shipyard on Spencer's Island. This shipyard was very primitive, or I would consider it DIY today. The crew of this shipyard got started building the first ship to be made there, as they could literally hear the lumberjacks not too far from them chopping the wood for this ship. There was no wood mill, so the crew of the shipyard had to use tools to turn the wood into usable planks to build the frame of this ship. When the frame of the ship was done, the cold Nova Scotia winter hit, and they had to leave the frame of this ship out to sweat out all of the moisture and become stronger. By the time spring hit, the whole of the ship was ready to be made, and they used salt to treat the wood, and the finishing touches were added, like the sails that had to be brought in from another location. By 1861, the ship was ready to be launched and named by Joshua himself. There is no way to verify why the ship got its name, but it was named the Amazon. It's believed that because ships are commonly referred to as she or her, he named the ship Amazon because of the strength of the Amazon women in Greek mythology and the strength of the ship. At 198 tons, the ship launched without a problem, despite popular rumors that someone was injured or died at its launch. Its first voyage was to carry timber to London with a Captain Robert McClellan. But before they could sail off, the captain fell ill and actually ended up dying before the ship ever took its first voyage. And its first voyage then became taking Captain Robert back to his wife he had just wedded right before he left to captain the ship. Captain Jack Parker then took over after the death of Captain Robert, but he was met with issues as well. The Amazon took damage from a fishing line and had to anchor for days to be repaired before he could successfully deliver the timber to London. Over the course of years, the Amazon successfully sailed the seas, needing repairs here and there, but it wasn't until 1867 that the life of the ship took a turn. For a while, the Amazon was being captained by Captain William Thompson. In 1867, he was set to pick up corn in Baltimore, Maryland, to bring to Halifax, Nova Scotia. While picking up corn in Boston, he received a letter that he was being replaced by another captain. Essentially, he was being fired. And like a scorned employee, he fired George Spicer, a seaman on his crew that also happened to be the son of one of the owners, and the captain took off to get a shipment of coal instead. This happened in early November, and at this time the waters of certain areas were not allowed to be sailed due to the weather by the insurance company. And sure enough, Captain Thompson was sailing in one of these areas when the Amazon was wrecked onto a beach. The insurance company wouldn't cover this wreck because of the policy, and the ship was abandoned by the owners. Only a week later, it was salvaged by a man named Alexander McBean and re-registered to Sydney Port in Nova Scotia. And very quickly, McBean sold the ship to another man named John Betty. In my research, I found out that ships cannot be registered to ports unless they are deemed seaworthy. So the damage wasn't as bad as reported by Captain Thompson. It's believed that when Captain Thompson got the news he was being fired, he took this opportunity to make some money scamming the owners out of the Amazon with this wreck, taking it to an area he knew insurance wouldn't cover and then claiming it was badly wrecked. They were left to abandon it, where McBean claimed it for himself to make some money and allegedly some for Captain Thompson. For the town of Spencer's Island, since the ship brought in so much revenue, it became known to them as the ship that forced them to eat with tin spoons. As for John Betty, he owned the Amazon, sailing it for years before it was wrecked in the state of Maine, abandoning it, where it was then towed to New York to be auctioned off. At the auction, a man named Richard W. Haynes bought the Amazon, not realizing that because he wanted to fly it with an American flag, he would need to pay an expensive import tax. He was not going to pay this. And to get around it, he claimed that he had basically spent so much money repairing the ship, essentially making it a brand new ship, and renaming it the Mary Celeste. He sailed the ship, now as the Mary Celeste, for 10 months, till it was seized for evading taxes. The now Mary Celeste was bought by a man named James Winchester, and he was met with lots of problems. The first was a surveyor who tried to blackmail James to pay the import tax, not paid by Haynes. The surveyor tried to seize the Mary Celeste again, but James took this man to court, and he won the case. With the case won, he had time to finally check out the Mary Celeste, only to discover that the ship Haynes had apparently just rebuilt was rotten and needed to be torn down to the waterline. The Mary Celeste was rebuilt now as a 280-ton ship with some new additions, and not realizing how expensive this was going to be, James had to sell shares of the ship. One share was sold to a lifelong seaman and master mariner, Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs, after he decided not to open up a hardware store with his brother. Captain Briggs was a family man. He was married to his childhood sweetheart, Sarah Elizabeth Briggs, and together the two of them had an 8-year-old son, Arthur Briggs, and a 2-year-old daughter, Sophia Matilda Briggs. Captain Briggs was going to be the captain of the Mary Celeste now, setting off on his first voyage with the ship in early November. This voyage, he was going to be accompanied by his wife and daughter, but had to leave behind his son with his mom in the family home since he was still in school. The first voyage was going to start at its port in New York Harbor with a destination of Genoa, Italy. In preparation for this, the three of them left early to make the ship a home. They spent days before setting sail playing music, writing letters, and they even had Sarah's brother and sister-in-law there for a meal. The only thing missing for Captain Briggs was his son Arthur. He wanted so badly to write home, to send him to the ship to be with them and just forget school, but ultimately they set sail on November 5th, 1872, without Arthur. But with a carefully selected 7-man crew, 28-year-old first mate Albert G. Richardson, 25-year-old second mate Andrew Gilling, 23-year-old stew and cook Edward Head, and then the rest of the crew as seamen, which can also be interchanged as deckhands on some boats. These men were 29-year-old Volker Lorenzo, his brother 23-year-old Boy Lorenzo, 35-year-old Arian Martins, and 23-year-old Gottlieb Goschel. The captain of the Mary Celeste and the crew were transporting an order of 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol worth about $35,000. This alcohol is not the type for drinking. It is similar to ethanol, which I go into some pretty in-depth detail when I covered the death of Rodney Marks, but denatured alcohol is used in an industrial setting for things like solvent, such as wood finish, and fuel for alcohol burners or camping stoves. The Mary Celeste set sail on November 5th, but due to bad weather had to be anchored outside Staten Island till November 7th, when they were able to finally sail the Atlantic Ocean. Following the Mary Celeste, only 8 days after they left was another ship named the Dei Gratia, carrying 1,735 barrels of petroleum. The Dei Gratia was captained by David Morehouse, with the same destination as the Mary Celeste, only 1,200 miles behind the Mary Celeste. They were meant to go north of the Azores Islands, while Mary Celeste was meant to go south, where they would then reconverge on the same path. Despite sailing through horrible storms, the Dei Gratia was making its way to Italy when the unexpected happened. On December 4th, 1872, 400 miles east of the Azores Islands, Captain Morehouse could see a set of sails 5 miles off their port bow, slowly approaching the ship. They couldn't see any crew on deck of this ship or at the helm. The sails that were up were unkempt and the ship was drifting erratically. The Dei Gratia tried to signal this ship multiple times with no answers. At this point, Captain Morehouse knew something was wrong, so he sent out a small team out on a rowboat to check it out. This small team consisted of his first mate, Oliver DeVoe, second mate, John Wright, and seaman John Johnson. When they got close enough, they noticed the ship was the Mary Celeste. The 2 men, Oliver DeVoe and John Wright, boarded the ship to investigate, while John Johnson stayed on the rowboat. This is where the story has a lot of fiction added or false statements later added by the 2 men who boarded the ship. I'm going to tell you about exactly what was found and reported by Oliver on that day. He noticed that some of the sails were left up, tattered and hanging ragged, while others had been pulled down in what seemed like a haste job. A portion of the port side railing was missing, and I think you can imagine at this point, but all of the crew, including Captain Briggs' wife and daughter, were missing. Not even the ship's cat was on board. All of the crew's belongings were left behind, except for the Lorenzo brothers, who didn't bring anything on board with them after losing their belongings in a shipwreck earlier that year. The beds were unmade after being slept in, so much so the imprint of 2-year-old Sophia was still in the bed. All of the cabins were wet, and the windows had been boarded up as if the crew had been battened down for the storms, but the skylight was open, letting in rain. There was still 6 months' worth of supplies on board. Then, when DeVoe checked ship pumps, he found them in perfect working condition despite 4 feet of water in the holds of the ship. And lastly, the ship's logs were only filled in till November 24th, 10 days before the ship was found in this state, with the beginning of November 25th's log on a board where they could log throughout the day before putting it into the book. At this point, the crew of the Dei Gratia was less worried about the missing crew of the Mary Celeste and more excited about the salvage reward they were going to collect on the ship and its order of denatured alcohol. Captain Morehouse knew that the Mary Celeste was still seaworthy, and he knew he couldn't tow it, so he sent Oliver DeVoe with 2 others to repair and captain the Mary Celeste back to port so they could collect the salvage reward. After only a few hours, this small crew got the Mary Celeste sails replaced with replacements found on board and pumped all of the water out of the boat. Oliver DeVoe, temporary captain of the Mary Celeste, erased Captain Briggs' handwritten logs off of the board and started to log on the board and the book from that point forward, essentially erasing the last written words of Captain Briggs. The Mary Celeste, despite the delay from needing to be repaired and the storms still hitting it in the area, being a faster ship than the Dei Gratia, came into port only a day after the Dei Gratia, with the now crew of 3 ready to collect their reward. The Mary Celeste was seized at this point. An investigation took place, searching the boat top to bottom, as the Dei Gratia's crew testified for their salvation rights. The only finding I didn't already tell you about was Captain Briggs' sword. It was found under his bed with what the investigators believed to be blood. Now this finding has been adapted into a rumor that the sword was found on deck with blood on both the sword and deck, but chemical testing debunked that there was any blood on the deck or sword. Likely, since the cabins were wet and the sword was under the bed, it was probably just rusted. Investigators had a few theories on what could have happened to the occupants of the Mary Celeste. First, Captain Winchester, in debt from the rebuild and the fees, mad that he had to share his ship with Captain Briggs, hired the crew to kill Captain Briggs and his family. But there was no evidence violence took place on the boat, and the crew also left behind their belongings. Why would they abandon ship after killing the Briggs family with none of their belongings? Or maybe the De Gratia crew waited for the Mary Celeste and then boarded the ship, killing the crew and taking the ship for the salvage reward. This is a theory that pirate-loving me can definitely see happening, but the Mary Celeste was a much faster ship than the De Gratia, and it had an 8-day head start. Even with storms slowing them down, it's unlikely that the De Gratia took off 8 days after them, got ahead of the Mary Celeste, and was able to take over the ship. And for the last one, was it possible Captain Briggs and Captain Morehouse were in on the scam together? With the help of Captain Morehouse and his crew, the Briggs family and the Mary Celeste crew would disappear with a lump of cash and start a new life. This was unbelievable to those who knew Captain Briggs, because they knew he wouldn't have left Arthur behind if his plan was to start a new life. Ultimately, the courts investigated this for a while, closing the proceedings on the ship in March of 1873. Giving it back to Captain Winchester with no answers to what happened to Captain Briggs, his family, and the crew. It became a mystery that really bothered not only people at the time, but throughout history. I mean, even today we are still here talking about them and the mysterious disappearances. Captain Winchester got a bill at the end of all of this for the salvage reward from the De Gratia crew, which he paid with no issue since they did recover the ship and the alcohol that ended up getting delivered. However, the investigators also tried to bill him for their work, which they dragged on for a while in Winchester's eyes, which he refused to pay. The same year that he got the boat back, in September of 1873, Winchester tried to sell the Mary Celeste, but now being looked at as a ghost ship, he was not having any luck. He did eventually sell the Mary Celeste to a ship company, and it felt like, from then on, she had very bad luck. Captains of the Mary Celeste kept dying before completing voyages. She had a few issues needing repairs, and switching hands till January 3rd, 1883, when the new owner of the Mary Celeste, with his choice of captain, decided they were going to make money and put Mary Celeste to rest once and for all. They loaded up the Mary Celeste with a shipment of expired booze and rotten fish that the owner overinsured. The crew aboard knew what was going to happen, being offered a payoff of whatever they could take from the ship, and some comforted by the fact that they were going to put this evil ship to rest. Together, the captain and the first mate made the decision to speed the Mary Celeste up as fast as she could and crash her into the rocky cliffs of Turk's Island. The crew took what they wanted, leaving behind the logbook, the only thing left with evidence of what happened to Captain Briggs and his crew, and then abandoned ship, leaving the Mary Celeste to be lost to the sea. The owner, the captain, and the first mate, however, did not get away with this. The insurance company caught on to what happened, going out to investigate the crash and taking the men to court, where at the time they faced death for the crime of intentionally sinking a ship. In court, the men admitted to their crimes, paying back all the money they had gotten from the insurance company, and I guess the Mary Celeste wasn't done, because in the matter of 6 months after the court hearings, the 3 men all died in different ways. 2 other ships were found and recovered, even though the Mary Celeste was not recovered, when the insurance company went out to investigate. These ships were the steamer Saxon and the schooner Mary D. Douglas. Both of these ships, after being recovered, on their first voyage out, were lost at sea, never seen again with the crew aboard. So what the heck happened to the Mary Celeste? And was she just a ship with bad luck from the start and end? Was it fraud or something more supernatural? Let's jump into these theories. We talked about the crew killing the Briggs family. We talked about the De Gratia crew attacking the crew of the Mary Celeste. And we talked about fraud helping the Briggs family start a new life. But what else is there? Well, first off, pirates. At this time in history, and even today, there are still pirates attacking ships out at sea, looking for ways to make money. This theory is basically that pirates came onto the Mary Celeste, killing the Briggs family and crew, but with nothing missing and no signs of violence, this one is not very likely. Maybe something more natural happened. Some believe water spouts, which is basically a tornado in the middle of the ocean, could have taken place, which could explain why there was so much water on board, and believing that she was taking on more water than she was, the crew abandoned ship. A seaquake could have struck the Mary Celeste, which is an earthquake on the seabed, causing turbulence. Maybe rattling the alcohol, and worried that it could cause an explosion, they abandoned ship. If any of these were the reason why, we would never know because we couldn't prove a seaquake did or didn't happen, and it did look like they left with a haste. The biggest argument against the water spout is that the Mary Celeste was still seaworthy. More of the sea monster and supernatural side, a giant or colossal squid, which we know a giant squid can be 43 feet long and 600 pounds, came onto the ship, taking the crew with it. This one is interesting, but squids, as creepy as they may be, are not predators, and marine life experts say are more afraid of us than we are of them. And my personal favorite, this theory came about because early on, newspapers claimed that they had found the Mary Celeste in perfect condition, clean, and dinner on the table ready to eat. This is, of course, that aliens came and took the crew of the Mary Celeste to never return them to their ship. For the last, and with recent research, it seems most likely that they abandoned ship due to fumes. This theory was originally created by Dr. Oliver Cobbs, a relative of Benjamin Briggs, pretty early on, but it seems to be most supported by researchers today. When the ships were transporting alcohol, they had hatches that needed to be opened up to air out any fumes and prevent any buildup. As we know, the Mary Celeste was in bad waters and weren't able to open up hatches as often as they needed. November 25th, the day they last logged on board, was actually a nice morning, so they probably opened up the hatches to air it out, except the buildup was more than what they expected, and the fumes would be enough to make a grown man dizzy, but for a 2-year-old girl, they would cause a lot more issues. For the safety of his family and the crew, they all boarded the lifeboat that was missing, tying it to the Mary Celeste, but far enough away it would be safe from any explosions. Well, the weather didn't stay nice that day. A storm came rolling in fast, and as the weather came in, they couldn't get back to the ship, losing their rope, either getting lost to the sea or wrecking in the bad water in just a lifeboat. Personally, I think either of these theories I said today are sad, and my mind prefers to think that they scammed Captain Winchester, starting a new life. But I want to know what you think, and I want to know what you think of Misty Mysteries, which you can do by checking out the podcast social media in the episode description, or leaving kind words where you are listening right now. And I will see you next week for more ghostly spooks and chilling crimes.